Today I'll be talking about budget decks for those who want to play various Magic formats with less of a financial barrier to entry. If you're just interested in a quick TLDR graphic, you can skip to the end for my recommendations. I'll also link my primer videos on each deck if you're interested in learning more about them. This video will focus on budget decks for Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy, with Standard briefly mentioned. I hope it's obvious why I'm not including formats like Pauper or Vintage for those who prefer to spend the same amount on cardboard as you would on a used car. Before I can talk about the decks, I have to define exactly what does and doesn't count as budget. For some, budget might mean a low, flat cost, but what exactly that is will vary from person to person. Is $500 budget? Is $200 low enough? Is $100? Budget may also refer to the cost relative to other decks in the format. For example, $1,000 is a lot of money, but if you're evaluating Legacy, where many decks range from $4,000 to $6,000, then $1,000 could be considered budget relative to those decks. It's also important to talk about what budget is not. Budget decks still have to be good. They can't just be whatever cards you happen to have in your collection, regardless of whether you can actually win with them. Sorry, 8-whack goblins. They're also not strictly worse non-budget decks with the expensive and necessary cards removed. Also consider a deck's long-term sustainability. If the metagame shifts and it's no longer viable, if it requires frequent upgrades from newly printed sets, or the deck gets banned and you have to buy another deck, then is it really budget? Before getting to paper cards, a brief aside on Arena and Magic Online. Magic Arena is technically free to play, but in practical terms, it's a de facto mobile game, uses the same business tactics, and has a terrible economy. Since it doesn't allow trading or direct purchase of individual cards, there's no way to circumvent paying the hundreds of dollars needed to build decks. Additionally, the cards can't be sold or transferred, meaning they're worthless, unlike Moto or Paper, where you can trade or sell your cards if you don't want them anymore. Many content creators have talked about the exorbitant cost of Arena, but that's a topic outside the scope of this video. In regards to Moto, the digital economy differs somewhat from Paper, with certain cards being significantly more or less expensive online than in real life. This is particularly true for older formats like Legacy. If you're interested in playing a variety of formats and like to switch decks frequently, you're better off using a rental program rather than buying the cards outright, whereas if you're fine sticking to few formats and only one deck, the reverse might be the case. In general, certain types of cards are what significantly contribute to a deck's cost, and playing decks that reduce or avoid them can be budget. The most common reasons for high prices historically are rare multicolored lands such as fetch lands, and playing an abundance of rares in general. Typically, budget options are often monocolor aggro decks, whereas mid-range control and value decks tend to be more expensive. For example, in current Standard, Mono Blue is extremely cheap, being less than $100, and that's including the $60 or so added by Ledger Shredder, which not all versions play. In older formats like Legacy, reserve list cards such as revised dual lands eat up a huge amount of deck costs. The good news for Pioneer is that many top-performing decks are already essentially budget, those being the monocolor aggro decks, Mono Blue Spirits, Mono Red Aggro, and Mono White Humans, all of which are around $200. My personal recommendation is Mono White Humans for a number of reasons. It's a solid deck, consistently performs well, and is more adaptable than the others. It's also capable of branching into other decks if needed, such as Green White Company. If aggro's not your style, the runner-up is Lotus Field combo at around $300. Modern. Gift Storm is by far the cheapest viable deck in Modern and can be built for around $250 since it doesn't require fetch lands. The price of the deck is overwhelmingly borne by the remaining multicolor lands, with most of the other cards being cheap. The deck is the most able of Modern's decks to bear downgrading the mana base, and you can further reduce costs by doing so. Affinity is a solid aggro deck at around $300, and although it can be argued it's a less explosive and resilient version of Hammer Time, it's significantly cheaper. About half the cost is taken up just by Urza Saga, but it's unfortunately irreplaceable. Belcher is a decent combo deck, coming in between $300 and $400. Although it's fallen out of favor somewhat since its debut, it's still a solid deck capable of winning events. Hollow One varies depending on the exact list, but you can build it for around $350. In general, I think it's worse than other aggro decks like Hammer Time, but it's still decent and can win tournaments. Burn is a tried and true Modern deck, coming in at around $450. If that's still too steep a price, technically the deck is mostly red and the majority of the cost is taken up by multicolor lands, so if you're willing to play a worse version by replacing Boros Charm and Lightning Helix with other spells, you can cut the red-white lands and drop the price by about $100, then upgrade to the full deck later. Also coming in at around $450 is Dredge, the classic graveyard deck. While Dredge is usually a solid option, it's much more vulnerable to being hated out than other decks, especially if the metagame shifts towards being more hostile to graveyards. Lastly, Tron is hardly a budget deck at around $750, but like it has proven long-term sustainability. Both decks have been in the format since its inception, and they're unlikely to be forced out of the metagame or banned, nor do either require frequent updates from new sets, so they can be solid long-term investments game-wise. Among Magic's popular formats, Legacy is the most expensive and has by far the highest financial barrier to entry. Despite that, there are budget options available. Burn is a Legacy legal deck and surprisingly good. At around $250 to $300, it's also fairly cheap, especially by the standards of Legacy. Unlike its modern counterpart, the deck is monocolor and thus requires no pricey lands. It's also 100% free of reserveless cards. From there though, there's a big price jump to the next viable deck. Oops All Spells is a solid combo deck coming in at around $750. Because of how its combo works, the deck can't play traditional lands and therefore plays no revised dual lands. Also, unlike Storm decks, it doesn't run Lion's Eye Diamond either, meaning it's free of reserveless cards. Oops All Spells is extremely vulnerable to Graveyard Hate, Storm Hate, and Counter Spells, but it's also a turn 1 to 2 combo deck, so if you're a high-risk individual and looking to play Legacy on a relative budget, it could be the deck for you. Moving up the money ladder from there are Mono Black and Sultai Depths, two Dark Depths combo variants that once again don't require revised dual lands or other reserveless cards, but are still quite pricey at around $900. These variants are not worse than Green-White Depths or Maverick, and each version has its merits, but Mono Black and Sultai are significantly cheaper, albeit still expensive. Next is D&T, the classic white tempo hate deck. Although the deck is around $1,000, its biggest strength price-wise is a total lack of dual lands or other reserveless cards, and its use of exclusively white or colorless staples, meaning you won't have to update it as often as other decks. Finally, it should be noted that Eldrazi Stompy is about the same price as D&T if you play a version without City of Traders, although I think D&T is the better investment. So that's my wrap-up of budget decks in Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy. My personal recommendations are listed on screen in yellow. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments, and take care.